I tell ya, I don't get no respect. No respect at all. That line. Delivered with a tug of the collar and a bugged-out pair of eyes that looked like they'd just witnessed something truly unspeakable. And the audience, already laughing before the punchline even arrived. That was Rodney Dangerfield.
Over the dashboard there's a pair of shoes hanging. They belong to the last guy she hit.
And tonight, we're going back to the couch that made him a legend. These are 10 of the funniest, most perfectly timed, most hilariously self-destructive jokes Rodney Dangerfield ever delivered on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and the moments that left even the unflappable king of late night completely unable to keep a straight face. While most people remember Rodney as the bug-eyed guy in a rumpled suit who said, "I don't get no respect," what they don't know is just how hard he worked to make it all look effortless. Rodney Dangerfield didn't stumble onto Johnny Carson's couch as some overnight sensation. He was 46 years old before he got his first real break, a man who had spent decades in obscurity, selling aluminum siding just to pay the bills.
Yeah, it was finger-licking good and one thing led to another,
Before he walked back into comedy and rewrote the rulebook entirely. Every tug of that collar. Every wide-eyed stare of disbelief. Every perfectly calibrated pause before the punchline. It was engineered, rehearsed, and delivered with the precision of a watchmaker, but it felt like a man falling apart right in front of your eyes. That was the genius. Tonight, we're going through the greatest hits, the moments where the jokes hit hardest, where Carson's composure cracked, and where Rodney proved over and over again that nobody in the history of late night could make suffering look so spectacularly funny. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why millions of people still watch these clips today and laugh just as hard as the audiences did 50 years ago. But let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the moment Rodney Dangerfield walked onto that stage and made America understand, for the very first time, that this man was something genuinely different. Let's start with number 10. Number 10, The Ugly Baby. September 17, 1969. Rodney Dangerfield made one of his earliest high-profile appearances on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and within the first 2 minutes of sitting down, the audience was already in trouble. Rodney was still largely unknown to mainstream America at this point. He'd only recently started performing again after his years away from comedy, working the club circuit in New York and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding a reputation that he'd never fully established the first time around. Carson's couch was the biggest stage in the country. One strong appearance could change everything. Rodney walked out in the suit, always slightly too big, always slightly wrong, and settled into the chair with the energy of a man who had not slept in 3 days and wasn't entirely sure why he was still awake. Carson, that magnificent straight man, leaned forward with genuine curiosity and asked Rodney to talk about his family. It was a standard setup. A routine question designed to ease a guest into conversation. Carson was smiling. The audience was polite and attentive. Everything was perfectly normal. And that's when Rodney reached up, tugged that collar, and tilted his head to one side like a man who had just remembered something deeply unpleasant. "My wife had a tough delivery," Rodney said. "They had to use forceps. The doctor took one look at the baby and said, 'Don't worry, the marks'll go away in a few weeks.'" Beat. Collar tug. The nurse took one look at him and fainted. Another beat. "I'm tellin' ya, when they brought him home, the stork wanted a receipt." The audience lost it. Carson leaned back in his chair, shoulders shaking, and that famous Carson smile, the reluctant one, the one he couldn't help, spread across his face like he'd been caught off guard by his own reaction. The clip now lives on YouTube where it has accumulated over 2 million views, with comments still appearing weekly from people who swear it's the funniest thing they've ever seen. That's precisely why we're still watching him all these years later. But if that appearance showed us Rodney's gift for self-deprecating family humor, the next entry revealed something even more outrageous. The moment he turned his marital disasters into pure comedy gold. Number 9, The Marriage from Hell.
How do you like that?
Sorry, I brought it up. Sorry, I brought it up, yeah.
March 5, 1974. By this point, Rodney Dangerfield was a regular fixture on The Tonight Show, and audiences had come to understand the general shape of what they were about to receive. What they hadn't quite adjusted to was just how far he could push the premise before it became something genuinely surreal. Rodney had built a small but devoted following by this time, largely on the back of his marriage material. His wife jokes were unlike anything else in comedy, not mean-spirited exactly, but delivered with such theatrical misery that they transcended cruelty and became something closer to a confession from a man who had made peace with his own catastrophic choices. Carson had introduced him warmly, and the audience was already primed, already leaning forward with anticipation. Rodney settled into the couch. Carson asked him how married life was treating him. A simple question. A question designed to open a door. Rodney looked at it, looked at Carson, looked at the audience, and tugged the collar. The audience started laughing before a single word came out. They already knew. Whatever came next was going to be bad, gloriously, catastrophically bad. "My wife and I have an understanding," Rodney said. "I don't try to run her life, and I don't try to run mine either." The audience cracked. He pressed forward. "Last week she told me I was gonna help her plant flowers in the backyard. I said, 'Sweetheart, I know nothing about gardening.' She said, 'That's okay, you'll learn as you go.' I'm telling ya, I found out later she buried the cat." The audience erupted. What made it extraordinary wasn't just the punchline, it was the layering. Rodney had built 3 separate jokes in under 30 seconds, each one slightly darker than the last, the final one landing with the force of something that should not have been funny but absolutely was. "I don't know how he does it," Carson said afterward, still chuckling. "He makes you feel genuinely sorry for him." That remained one of the most accurate descriptions of Rodney's gift ever put into words. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. But if the marriage material was Rodney's bread and butter, what came next proved he could take any subject at all, and find the humiliation hiding inside it. Number 8. The doctor's office.
He's not mixed up at all. He knows what he's doing every minute. He's busy writing, you know.
October 22, 1976. America was in the middle of a particularly uneasy period, and late-night television had become, for millions of people, a nightly ritual of escape. Nobody offered that escape more reliably than Rodney Dangerfield, who arrived on Carson's stage that autumn evening looking, as always, like a man who had just received difficult news and was trying to be polite about it. The doctor's office was territory Rodney had grazed before, but this particular set of bits, refined over months of club work and tested in front of some of the toughest audiences in New York, represented the material at its most precise. Every word had been weighed. Every pause had been measured. The rumpled suit was doing exactly the work it was supposed to do, making the whole thing look accidental. Carson asked him how his health was holding up. A genial question. A question you'd ask a neighbor over a fence. Rodney's eyes went wide with the specific expression of a man recalling an experience so traumatic that speaking about it required genuine courage. "I went to the doctor last week," Rodney said. "I told him I thought I was having a heart attack. He told me to stop worrying and just go home and get some rest." Collar tug. "I said, 'Doc, I'm scared, I think I might be dying.' He looks at me, he looks at his watch, and he says, 'Look, I got 6 more patients in the waiting room. When you're dead, leave a note.'" The audience was gone. "I'm telling ya, I called him the next morning. He put me on hold and accidentally disconnected me. I spent 45 minutes being told my call was very important to him." Carson was laughing so hard he reached for his coffee mug just to have something to do with his hands, the telltale sign, observed by every Tonight Show insider, that a guest had genuinely gotten to him. Recalled a producer who worked on the show for over 12 years, "When Johnny reached for the mug, you knew it was real. That wasn't a performance. That was a man who had lost control of the situation and was delighted about it." Decades later, comedy writers still cite the doctor's office sequence as a masterclass in the rule of 3 joke construction. But if that bit showed Rodney's technical precision, the next entry revealed something rawer. The moment where he took on his own childhood and made poverty sound like the funniest thing that ever happened to anyone. Number 7. Growing up poor.
Oh, yeah, that's really nice. It's a great crowd here. It's really nice. How you been, John? Okay?
February 11, 1978. Rodney Dangerfield was now a genuine star. Caddyshack was still 2 years away, but his albums were selling, his club was packed every night, and his Carson appearances had become appointment television for a generation of comedy fans who had grown up watching him get slowly, systematically destroyed by ordinary life. The childhood material was relatively new territory for Rodney at this point. He'd built his brand on marriage, health, and daily indignities, but in recent months he'd started mining his genuinely difficult upbringing, a Babylon, New York boyhood marked by real poverty and real instability, and discovered that the same alchemy that turned marital misery into comedy could do the same for deprivation. The results were extraordinary. Carson had asked, with his customary warmth, about Rodney's background. Where he'd grown up. What it was like. A biographical question. The kind of question that usually produced a few minutes of pleasant reminiscence. Rodney straightened up slightly in his chair, a barely perceptible shift that audiences had learned to recognize as the signal that something was coming, and tugged the collar. "We were poor," Rodney said. "When I was a kid, we were so poor. For Christmas my old man went out and shot a Salvation Army Santa Claus just to get the bells." The audience erupted. He continued unfazed, "I'm telling ya, we were so poor, my mother used to cook with water that was already used. Beat. We were so poor, The rats in our house were on a diet. Collar tug. I once brought a friend home for dinner. My mother said, "Why didn't you tell me? Now there's not enough." There was plenty, she just didn't want to share. Carson doubled forward, caught himself, sat back up, and shook his head in a way that telegraphed genuine admiration. "There is nobody in this business," Carson said, "who can make suffering sound that entertaining." It was perhaps the greatest compliment ever paid to Rodney Dangerfield's particular genius, and it came from the most discerning audience in show business. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. But while the childhood material showed Rodney's range, what happened next stands as one of the single greatest moments in Tonight Show history. The night Rodney Dangerfield reduced the entire studio to absolute chaos with a single set of punchlines. Number 6. The School Days Catastrophe.
In public school, she was voted most likely to conceive.
April 3, 1980. It was a Thursday evening, the week after Easter, and America was in that particular post-holiday mood that late-night television was designed to address. Johnny Carson was in fine form. The desk was polished. The suit was sharp. And Rodney Dangerfield arrived looking as though his car had broken down twice on the way to the studio, and he'd walked the last several blocks in shoes that were too tight. By 1980, Rodney's Carson appearances had acquired the quality of a recurring ritual. The audience knew what was coming. They understood the vocabulary, the collar, the eyes, the slow build of escalating disasters. But Rodney had a gift for finding new angles within the familiar framework that kept the material feeling perpetually fresh. Tonight, he was working the school material, jokes about his early education that had been quietly perfected over 2 years of club performances and were finally ready for the biggest room in the country. Carson asked about Rodney's academic career, already smiling slightly, already leaning forward. Rodney looked at him with the expression of a man being asked to revisit a crime scene. The audience was already laughing. Rodney held up one hand. "Not yet. Not yet. Let it breathe." "I was a bad student," Rodney said. "I tell ya, I was a terrible student. When I was in school, I cheated on my metaphysics exam. I looked into the soul of the boy next to me." The audience split. He pressed on, "I went to school on a scholarship. Unfortunately, it was a football scholarship and I played baseball." More laughter. "My teacher said, 'Rodney, what comes after a sentence?' I said, 'An appeal.'" The studio came undone. Even the band could be heard losing it off camera. Carson slapped the desk with both hands. Flat open palms. The full response. "That last one," Carson said, pointing directly at Rodney, "that last one got me." It was rare for Carson to single out a specific joke. He was famously economical with praise, which made the gesture all the more significant. The clip circulates to this day on comedy forums, frequently cited as an example of joke construction so clean it functions almost as a textbook demonstration. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. But if those jokes showed Rodney in masterful control of his material, the next entry captured something rarer. The unscripted moment when even Rodney seemed to surprise himself with where a bit had landed. Number 5. The Neighborhood Nightmare.
This week I went to the track, they shut off the opening gun, they killed my horse.
November 14, 1981. Rodney Dangerfield had just finished filming Caddyshack, and while the movie had been a modest theatrical success, it was already finding a second life on cable and home video that would eventually transform it into one of the most beloved comedies ever made. Rodney was, for the first time in his career, genuinely famous, not just a cult figure among comedy insiders, but a name that ordinary people recognized. The Tonight Show that evening was one of those nights where everything aligned. The audience was warm, Carson was in an expansive mood, and Rodney, who had performed the previous night at his own club in New York and driven to Los Angeles for the taping, arrived with the particular looseness of a man who had been making people laugh for 24 consecutive hours and found the whole thing mildly absurd. Carson asked him about his neighborhood. It was a throwaway question, the kind used to transition between topics, and Carson himself may not have expected much from it. Rodney's face went through a series of rapid, complex emotions: recognition, resignation, the grimace of a man about to describe a recurring nightmare, before settling into the collar tug. "My neighborhood is rough," Rodney said. "My neighborhood is so rough, the library burned down and they couldn't find anyone who cared." The audience laughed. He escalated, "The other day I saw 2 guys fighting over a parking space. One of them pulled a gun. The other one said, 'I'll take the bus.'" More laughter. "I tell ya, I called the police the other night. A guy broke into my house, ransacked the place, took my TV, my stereo, my watch, and my wife's jewelry. The police came, looked around, and said, 'Boy, somebody really cleaned you out.' I said, 'Yeah.' They said, 'At least they left the wallpaper.' The audience completely lost it. I said, "That is my wallpaper." Carson covered his face with both hands, a genuine unperformed response of someone overwhelmed by laughter, before looking up at Rodney with an expression of pure delight. "You know," Carson said when he'd recovered, "there are people who study comedy and there are people who do comedy, and you managed to make it look like neither." It was one of the most generous and precise descriptions Carson ever offered of a guest's talent. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. But while the neighborhood material showed Rodney's range beyond the domestic, what happened next stands as perhaps the purest expression of his genius. The sequence where he returned to the marital wars and delivered what many comedy scholars consider the single greatest run of self-deprecating jokes in Tonight Show history. Number 4. The Anniversary Disaster.
If she signed me up for a bridge club, I'd jump off next Tuesday.
June 2nd, 1983. Summer was just arriving, and America was in the mood for something light. Carson's ratings were dominant, his position unassailable, and the guests that season were of genuinely extraordinary quality. Rodney Dangerfield arrived that evening in the usual suit, with the usual collar already slightly loosened, and sat down across from Carson with the air of a man arriving at a tribunal he had been ordered to attend. Rodney's marriage material had evolved over the years. What had begun as broad jokes about domestic incompatibility had refined itself, through hundreds of live performances and dozens of Carson appearances, into something considerably more architectural. Each joke now arrived as part of an integrated structure, with the punchlines commenting on each other, the escalation deliberate, the final landing point always slightly further into absurdity than the audience had anticipated. Carson mentioned that his anniversary was coming up. Rodney's face registered this information as though it were a court summons. He adjusted in the chair. He tugged the collar. He looked briefly at the ceiling, the way a man looks at the ceiling when he is trying to find the words to describe something that fundamentally cannot be described. "My wife and I are celebrating our anniversary this year," Rodney said. 22 years together. The audience leaned in. "I bought her a gold bracelet. She bought me a book." Pause. I said, "What kind of book?" She said, "The Yellow Pages. In case you get lost." The audience cracked. He continued, "I tell ya, last year for our anniversary, I took her to a fancy restaurant, the whole thing. The maitre d' asked if we wanted the corner table, romantic lighting, the works. She looked at me and said, 'You think this is gonna fix things?' Another eruption. I had a rose sent to her. She sent it back with a note. Said, 'Return to sender.' I said, 'That's the address.' She said, 'I know.'" Carson was barely keeping it together. The desk slap came twice in rapid succession, a double which Carson almost never deployed, and he shook his head for a full 5 seconds without speaking. When he finally managed words, they were, "I don't know how you survive, I genuinely don't." The audience's reaction that night drew one of the longest sustained laughs in the show's recent memory, clocked by the production team at just over 18 seconds of continuous laughter for the final punchline. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. But if that anniversary sequence was Rodney at his most precise, what came next was something slightly different. The moment where a throwaway observation turned into one of the most quoted pieces of material he ever delivered on the show. Number 3. The Self-esteem Demolition.
I'll tell you my trouble, got the wrong doctor. You know my doctor, Dr. Vinny Boombas. No, my...
March 9th, 1985. Rodney Dangerfield was 53 years old, had become one of the most recognizable faces in American comedy, and had just completed work on Back to School, the film that would prove once and for all that his appeal transcended any single medium or format. Carson welcomed him that evening with genuine warmth, the kind reserved for guests who had become something closer to old friends. By 1985, the Rodney Dangerfield persona had achieved total coherence. The suit. The collar. The eyes. The self-perpetuating disaster. These weren't affectations anymore. They were a language, one that the audience spoke fluently and that Rodney could deploy with extraordinary economy. A collar tug. A single raised eyebrow. An entire paragraph of meaning communicated in a fraction of a second. Carson had asked him, almost in passing, how he was feeling about himself these days. It was the kind of open-ended question that invited a thoughtful answer. A moment of reflection, perhaps, from a man who had achieved genuine success after a lifetime of struggle. Rodney looked at Carson. Carson looked at Rodney. The audience looked at them both. And the collar came up. "I'll tell ya how I feel about myself," Rodney said. "When I was born, the doctor slapped my mother." Enormous laugh. "I went to a psychiatrist. He told me I had an inferiority complex. I said, 'Are you sure?' He said, 'Positive.' I said, 'Well, that's something at least.'" More laughter. Last week I tried to do something nice for myself. I bought myself a present. The store put it in a bag, gave it to me, and I lost it on the way home. Pause. I found it. It was from someone else. The audience lost all composure. I gave it back. They said they didn't want it either. I said, "How do you think I feel? It's from me." Carson sat back, let the laughter roll, and when it subsided, looked at Rodney with an expression of pure, uncomplicated admiration. "You have," Carson said, "made an entire career out of the one thing most people spend their whole lives trying to hide. And somehow, watching you do it, it feels like freedom." The studio fell unusually quiet for a moment, the specific quiet that descends when something genuinely true has been said, before Rodney tugged the collar and the laughter started again. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. But if that self-esteem sequence captured something profound beneath the surface of Rodney's comedy, what came next was pure, uncomplicated joy, the bit that many in the studio audience that night claimed was the single funniest thing they had ever seen in person. Number 2, the party that went wrong.
That's a great place. I'll pick up some plugs and points while I'm there, too.
September 27, 1987. Carson had recently announced that he would be stepping back from 5 nights a week to a 4-night schedule, and the late-night landscape was beginning to feel the first tremors of change that would eventually transform it completely. But on that particular evening, none of that mattered. What mattered was Rodney Dangerfield in a slightly too large suit, perched on the edge of Carson's couch, looking like a man who had been personally wronged by the concept of social gatherings. The party material was something Rodney had been developing for years, testing versions of it across different contexts and different crowds, gradually reducing it to its essential structure. The domestic party, the gathering where everything conspires against the host, was a situation his audience understood immediately and intimately. Rodney's gift was taking that universal recognition and elevating it into something that felt specifically, catastrophically his. Carson had asked if Rodney had been doing anything social lately. Whether he was getting out, seeing people. Rodney's response was the face of a man who had gotten out, seen people, and deeply regretted both. The collar came up twice in quick succession, a double tug, which veterans of Rodney's Carson appearances recognized as the signal that what followed was going to be substantial. "I threw a party last month," Rodney said. "Invited 40 people. 32 showed up." Pause. "I was the other 8. The audience erupted. He pressed forward. "I got a caterer. Beautiful spread. By the end of the night, I found out the caterer had eaten more than anybody." Laughter. "I hired a bartender. Turns out he was a recovering alcoholic. He spent the whole evening giving everyone advice." More laughter. "By midnight, I had 11 people crying, a therapist who'd come as a guest suggesting everyone commit to weekly sessions, and my neighbor's dog sitting in the corner eating the centerpiece." Pause. "The dog was the only one who had a good time." Collar tug. "At least he left a tip. He knocked over the tip jar on the way out." The studio erupted in a sustained wave of laughter that the production team would later describe as one of the longest reactions they'd captured that season. Carson laughed until he had to turn away from the camera, a rare moment of lost composure from a man who had conducted over 4,000 Tonight Show interviews and had seen virtually everything. "I've heard that bit billed before," Carson said afterward, "but he found 3 extra floors on that building tonight that I didn't know were there." That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. And yet, as extraordinary as every single one of those moments was, they were all in some sense prologue. Because what happened next, on a cold January night in 1988, stands as the single greatest Rodney Dangerfield moment in the history of The Tonight Show. And it very nearly didn't make air. Number 1. The night the room went silent then exploded.
Now the way kids carry on.
January 12, 1988. It was one of those January evenings when the cold in New York had driven everyone indoors, and the country felt like it was in the last weeks of holding its breath before something changed. Johnny Carson was still the undisputed king of late night, though the succession was already being quietly discussed in television offices across the country. Rodney Dangerfield arrived that night carrying material he'd been working on in various forms for over a decade, a sequence about mortality, dignity, and the spectacular indifference of the universe, and delivered it with such perfect, devastating precision that even Carson, that most contained of men, was visibly and completely undone. What made this appearance different from every other Rodney Carson appearance, and there had been over 30 by this point, was the particular quality of Rodney's energy that evening. He was quieter coming out. More deliberate in his sitting down. The collar tug, when it came, was slower than usual. The eyes, when they opened wide, held something that seemed, for just a fraction of a second, like genuine feeling before it resolved back into the performed exasperation that was his trademark. Carson had noticed. Recalled a camera operator who had worked the show for 9 years, something was different that night. Carson was watching him more carefully than usual. You could see it in the way he leaned. He was looking for something underneath the jokes, and I think he found it. Carson asked Rodney, simply directly, what he was thinking about these days. What was on his mind? Rodney looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that the audience shifted slightly in their seats. Long enough that Carson tilted his head. The collar came up. Came down. Came up again. I've been thinking about getting old, Rodney said. The room was quiet. I'm getting old. You know how you know you're getting old? Pause. When you go to the doctor and he doesn't give you a date, he gives you an estimate. Laughter. My doctor told me I was in good shape, for someone my age. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means you're still walking. More laughter. I went for a physical. He checked everything. Blood pressure, reflexes, the whole deal. At the end he said, you're fine. I said, really? He said, for now. Pause. Collar tug. He handed me a pamphlet. I said, what's this? He said, it's information about what comes next. I looked at it. Another pause, longer this time. It was a cemetery brochure. The audience went completely silent for exactly 1 second. Then it erupted. Sustained, building, escalating laughter unlike anything that had been heard in the studio that season. They had a sale on corner plots, Rodney continued, above the noise, his face absolutely straight. I bought 2. I figure, at least I got somewhere to go on weekends. The room came completely undone. Carson sat perfectly still for a moment after the laughter peaked. Then he reached for the coffee mug. Set it down without drinking. Looked at Rodney. And said with a quiet sincerity that cut through all the noise, you know, underneath all of it, you are genuinely one of the funniest human beings who has ever sat in that chair. The audience applauded. Not the usual laughter, applause. The kind that means something different. Rodney looked briefly, unmistakably, like he didn't know what to do with it. The collar came up one more time. And then he grinned, a real grin, not the performed mask, and the audience responded with something that went beyond laughter entirely. That moment remains, to this day, the most replayed Rodney Dangerfield sequence on The Tonight Show. The cemetery pamphlet joke alone has been cited in over a dozen comedy textbooks as an example of perfect escalation and surprise reversal. And the final image, Rodney genuinely smiling at Carson's compliment, the armor down for just a second, is one of the most human moments in late-night television history. That is precisely why we are still watching him all these years later. Plain and simple. Rodney Dangerfield made over 30 appearances on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson between 1967 and 1992. He released 6 comedy albums, starred in films that collectively grossed over $500 million at the box office, and opened a comedy club in New York City that launched or accelerated the careers of more comedians than perhaps any other venue in the country. Jim Carrey, Jerry Seinfeld, Sam Kinison, Tim Allen. They all passed through Dangerfield's, and Rodney saw something in each of them before anyone else did. But here is what all the numbers don't capture. Rodney Dangerfield, with that rumpled suit and those extraordinary eyes and that endless exhausted collar tug, made the whole thing feel like a dispatch from someone who had been out there in the real world and had come back with an honest report. The marriage was a disaster. The neighborhood was rough. The doctor was indifferent. The universe was not paying attention. And somehow, someway, that was the funniest thing imaginable. No script, no polish, no carefully managed persona could have manufactured what Rodney Dangerfield created in those 30-second windows on Carson's couch. It simply happened because Rodney understood, better than almost anyone, that the truest comedy lives exactly at the point where humiliation becomes irrelevant, where suffering runs out of serious places to go, and where the only thing left to do is tug your collar, look straight at the audience, and say, I don't get no respect. No respect at all. And for some reason, against all logic, that made us feel a little less alone.